how do I prove that I'm a victim of domestic abuse to get support from a counsellor? And this is a question that we've seen in multiple situations with the training we do online and in person. We do bespoke training for domestic abuse teams around the country. And this is a question that always comes up. And the reason it always comes up is lots of people approach the local authority, they mention that they're being abused, and the very first thing the council says to them is, where's the police crime reference number? Without a police crime reference number, we can't do anything, we can't help you out. And that is entirely false. There are loads of different situations, good situations, or certainly understandable situations where you would not have any evidence at all of the abuse. And I'm going to start just going to the Code of Guidance, 21.24 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance. So again, it's a publicly available document, PDF, just search for Homelessness Code of Guidance, you'll get the whole lot. And chapter 21 is all about domestic abuse, so it's really worth reading the whole chapter if you're ever in contact with people in this situation. But there's some really good stuff, and actually I would say that this is a really good example of how housing law is really good around domestic abuse. It's never going to be perfect because domestic abuse is so complicated, but ultimately the principles within it would be really good if it is actually being enacted by different councils. So if we look at 21.24, the second half of it, in some cases, corroborative evidence of actual or threatened violence may not be available, for example, because there were no adult witnesses and/or the applicant was too frightened or ashamed to report incidents to family, friends or the police. Housing authorities should not have a blanket approach towards domestic abuse which requires corroborative or police evidence to be provided. So that's our starting point. Now, it's probably worth saying here that with the Domestic Abuse Act particularly, but it's not, in one sense, domestic abuse has always been recognised within housing law, or certainly has been for many years before the Domestic Abuse Act came in. The issue with councils have with it is that in theory it could be weaponised by someone as a way to kind of get this kind of easy way into housing. Now, I just want to say how seldom I think that really happens, but technically it could happen, particularly with the Domestic Abuse Act. You now have a situation where if you are homeless as a result of domestic abuse and you are eligible for assistance, then you'll just know from the start that you're going to be owed the main homelessness duty or the final accommodation offer or whatever. So that's what there's so much riding on whether or not you're actually being abused. And there are also situations where potentially both parties involved may report that they're the victim and the other person's the perpetrator, which can be very difficult for local authorities to really kind of unpick. So I'm not saying that local authorities don't have a difficult job in their hands, and good housing officers have to really kind of be very careful and very sensitive, but also quite wily about how they kind of consider all this evidence. But as I say, as this paragraph shows, that actually you won't necessarily have any evidence, and just because you don't have evidence is not enough just to dismiss someone and fob them off. You would need to go, as a housing officer, you need to go into a lot more detail with them, spend time just kind of unpicking that situation. There's other things within this chapter of the Code of Guidance which are really good, so it kind of has very, very clear expectations on the council that they've given specialist domestic abuse training and risk assessment training to all housing options officers on duty. And so that's something, if you're an advocate, that's a really easy win with the council's FOI request system, or with the council's housing committees or domestic abuse committees or whatever, to basically just ask them, what training has your housing options officers actually had on this? And the Code of Guidance also says that the council should have a robust domestic abuse policy in place, and this is something in Bedford we've been chasing them for years because they still don't have one. As far as I know, unless they've done it in the last few weeks, they still don't have a policy which says how their staff should respond to domestic abuse. And the last time we asked them, John Allen from Just Us asked them, he basically said, where's the policy? And their response was, we just use, the Code of Guidance. And actually, John's just worked on a case where a victim of domestic abuse was sent back to their abuser and then was subject to further abuse and then got compensation from the council, just as an example of how this kind of plays out with councils in reality. So it's certainly something that, as an advocate service or someone who's looking to get homelessness reduced and minimised or whatever, then it's something that you could go into the Code of Guidance and just basically just hold the council to account on these types of points. There's a little bit more I want to say about this paragraph though, in that there's actually another good reason why people won't go to the police, and that is that the powers the police have are actually pretty weak in many ways. So I remember working with someone, really difficult situation she was in, really cool person, really sad to kind of see how it all went through, but basically the best the police could do in that situation was to get a domestic abuse stalking and harassment order. I can't remember if that, there's something like that, it's stalking and harassment or something like that. I can't remember the actual name of the order. And she was like, okay, how does that all work? And the police were like, well, there's going to be a court order in place, which means the perpetrator can't contact you within the next 30 days. And she was like, well, 30 days doesn't really seem worth it because he's just going to keep going after that. So actually there's going to be cases where, particularly where you've got people who've been to the police before and they weren't great, or they just weren't able to do anything. Actually, that's a very good reason why they might not go to the police again. So if you're in this kind of situation, I guess, and I'm not a domestic abuse specialist, but this is the kind of advice I've had from domestic abuse professionals, is that there is still plenty you can do to kind of help yourself down the line. So if for example, you are subject to abuse, you're not happy with the situation, but you're not quite sure whether you want to flee, you don't know what that looks like yet, you don't know how that's going to impact your family and your children and so on, then you can still keep a contemporaneous, which means like at the time, record of what's going on. And that might be just the case of emailing a trusted family member or friend, just to say, look, this my partner or my family member has done this, and just kind of give like a kind of a bit of an overview of what happened. And once you've kind of done that a few times, you kind of build up this body of evidence yourself, which you can then use to kind of show to councils. And any decent housing officer would absolutely take that. I mean, just to say a few things about housing officers, they have various duties under the Care Act, and also kind of not necessarily duties but requirements to report different types of abuse. So if you're reporting to a housing officer that you are being abused, they should be potentially raising a safeguarding alert about that situation. I'm not saying in every situation they'd have to do it, but they really should be doing it, in my opinion. Because I would say even if you're victim of domestic abuse, that in itself is some kind of care and support need. That term care and support need is not really very clearly defined, as far as I know, within the Code of Guidance, within the Care Act, Code of Practice, whatever it's called. But certainly, needing that additional support around domestic abuse, I think would certainly qualify with that wording of care and support need. And ultimately, if you go to a local authority, they're likely to have a policy. Again, just using Bedford as an example, their adult safeguarding policy says that, essentially says, any concerns of abuse must be reported immediately, and in all cases within 24 hours of it being reported. So that puts this duty on council officers to do that. So, they can't just fob you off. Not only should they be taking you very seriously, but they should also be raising safeguarding alerts. That might also involve a children's services referral if there are children involved, if there are children witnessing the abuse. They should, again, be very sensitively, very carefully suggesting that, or maybe more than suggesting it, actually saying they're going to have to raise those concerns with children's services. And it's not that children's services are going to take your kids away. They should be looking to just provide additional support around that situation. So just again, this is a statistic I constantly or frequently refer to. We had a massive problem with Bedford Borough Council, within when we started Just Us up, and kind of a few years afterwards, where they were just kind of taking absolutely no action. They were kind of telling lots of victims of domestic abuse that the abuse hadn't happened. And so we did an FOI request, which basically said, how many safeguarding alerts did the whole housing team make in the whole of 2016? And the answer was 0. They should be making hundreds. They're now making hundreds. And that FOI request in itself was enough to get the council thinking about, why on earth is our housing service not making safeguarding referrals. So that's the kind of thing that should be happening alongside the housing application or the homeless application, is they should be looking at this stuff. And again, I'm going to mention Part 6 and Part 7 here. So Part 7 is all about homelessness and the Housing Act. Part 6 is all about the housing register, and lots of people apply to the housing register, and they'll tell the online form whether it's ticking a box, or they'll put something explicit saying, I want housing because I'm being abused. And that should be enough in itself to make a homeless application. The council should have a system which is fit for purpose and would automatically flag that to a human being, who can then look at the application and say, okay, this person's approached us for housing, and actually they've given us reason to believe they might be homeless. So that's actually triggered Section 184 of the Housing Act, and a homeless application should then follow. So last few bits I just want to say about evidential stuff. I remember working with one lady, single mum, now single mum. Her husband was causing her a lot of grief, and the way we were able to evidence that was through conversations she'd had with the children's centre staff that her child was attending. So again, you have to sometimes kind of think outside the box a little bit to kind of get that evidence. And in theory, you shouldn't need it, but if you have got it, then obviously it makes things far less stressful. There's a story I kind of tell frequently. Again, I probably get bored of saying it really, but John Allen, who, as I say, still works for Just Us, he went into a housing option service with a lady who was 30 weeks pregnant, something like that, 7 months pregnant, and was greeted by an absolutely outrageously bad housing officer. We knew this housing officer already. We'd had lots of run-ins with her, and John just said to the client, look, just this housing officer's bad. Let's just do what we need to do to get you a roof over your head. So the first thing the housing officer said was, looked at her, she's visibly pregnant. She said, I'm going to need you to do a pregnancy test in the customer service centre toilets. And John was like, look, just allow it. Let's just get a roof over your head. Let's just do it. So she went and did it, came back, it was positive. Housing officer then said, this isn't enough. I need to see a green book from your midwife. And again, John was like, look, let's just go and get it. Let's just get this job done. Let's get out of the way, get this kind of sorted. So they did that. They brought the green book back, and the housing officer was then like, it's not enough. I need to see a scan photo. And again, they were able to do it and get a house. And John complained, and that housing officer didn't work there for much longer. But ultimately, if you think about that in terms of providing evidence about pregnancy, which is really obvious, just think how much more difficult it can be to show that someone's being abused, particularly where you've got those emotional kind of psychological types of abuse, which aren't very well defined within the Domestic Abuse Act. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you're a professional, there are things that you could be doing. If you've got concerns about someone, even if they're not yet at that place to kind of tell if they're turning up to your service with black eyes and they're saying, I fell over or something. Those are things you just record. You don't have to say, I think it's domestic abuse, but you would record them somewhere as just a concern, just as something to flag that you could then refer to when supporting that person to make a homeless application down the line. So yeah, I'm going to finish with something which is going a little bit off piste, but this is something I feel very strongly, and that is that as professionals, we expect victims of domestic abuse to do incredibly difficult, incredibly brave things by, potentially committing to flee, potentially with family and losing the job, and you have kids, all that sort of stuff's involved. So they're in a very, very difficult situation, and often the perpetrator is genuinely dangerous. And yet we expect them to take these risks effectively to flee. That time of fleeing is known to be a really kind of high risk time for that victim. It's a time where the abuse may well escalate. So we expect them to do that. But if we are not brave enough to challenge local authority officers when they are just being dicks, basically, then I would say that, in my opinion, this is probably a bit strong, but in my opinion, we shouldn't be in that job. If we're expecting our clients to do something brave that we're not prepared to take on a council, and let's face it, the council officer's not dangerous, they're not going to come and beat us up or anything. If we're not willing to do that, then, as I say, I don't think we should be in that job. That's just my opinion. But as I say, I think as professionals, we just need to reflect on how difficult the situation is for people in that situation. And in my opinion, we should, if the council officer is not being decent, we need to go strong arming them, complaining about them, doing whatever we can to get them into line and actually applying the law correctly. So yeah, hopefully that helps. I don't know what to say really. Hopefully that's helpful. Certainly food for thought. And yeah, again,